The HOA thought they could erase a war hero, kidnap him, silence him, and finally take his home by force. Carol Matthews and her corrupt board ran the neighborhood like a private empire, using fraud and intimidation to destroy anyone who stood in their way. But Walter Carter wasn't just some stubborn old man. He was a former counterintelligence officer with enough evidence to bring them all down. And when the truth exploded, the entire operation collapsed in a way no one saw coming. Jacob Carter pulled into the driveway of his grandfather's house, a place that had stood untouched for decades like a relic of a different era. The old single-story home, with its weathered brick exterior and front porch swing, was a stark contrast to the sterile, cookie-cutter houses that surrounded it. The HOA had been on his grandfather's case for years, insisting the property didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. But his grandfather, a stubborn war veteran, had always refused to budge. He had fought in the Persian Gulf, and no pencil-pushing suburban overlords were going to push him around. At least, that's what Jacob thought, until now. Something was wrong. The screen door was ajar, rocking slightly with the breeze. That alone wouldn't have been cause for alarm, but the front door, it was wide open. His grandfather wasn't the type to forget to close a door, let alone leave it gaping like an invitation for trouble. Jacob's pulse kicked up as he stepped out of his car, the crunch of gravel under his boots unnaturally loud in the eerie stillness. His grandfather's old Ford truck was parked in its usual spot, which meant he hadn't gone anywhere willingly. Jacob took a cautious step toward the house, scanning the porch. That's when he saw it. The cane. It lay abandoned near the steps, just off the pathway leading to the house. A simple wooden cane, sturdy but worn, the kind his grandfather never left behind. His fingers tightened into fists at his sides. His grandfather needed that cane to walk. He never went anywhere without it. Jacob reached the porch in 3 long strides, stepping over the cane as a cold pit settled in his stomach. Something had happened here. The old wooden planks creaked beneath his weight as he crossed the threshold into the house. Inside, the air was thick, still carrying the faint scent of old coffee and gun oil, his grandfather's signature. But something else lingered. Something off. The silence wasn't normal. His grandfather always had a radio playing, some old blues record crackling from the speakers. Now there was nothing. Jacob's eyes scanned the living room, but everything looked untouched. The same old recliner, the military medals on the wall, the folded American flag displayed on the mantel. But then his gaze landed on the kitchen table. A single envelope sat there, placed almost too deliberately in the center of the wooden surface. The HOA logo was stamped in the corner. Jacob's stomach twisted. His grandfather had been butting heads with the HOA for years, refusing to sell, refusing to bow to their endless citations about the unappealing nature of his home. They wanted him gone. They wanted the house gone. And now his grandfather was missing. And the only thing left behind was a letter from the people who wanted him out. That wasn't a coincidence. Jacob snatched up the envelope, tearing it open with rough fingers. The letter inside was a formal notice, but its message was anything but subtle. Notice of property violation. Immediate action required. It was the same legal jargon, the same threats, the same bureaucratic bullying his grandfather had been receiving for years. But at the bottom, scrawled in ink, was something new. This is your final warning. Jacob felt his breath hitch. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something hotter, something sharper. Rage. They had taken him. He didn't know how. He didn't know where. But he knew who. And they had just made a mistake they couldn't take back. Jacob didn't just walk into the HOA office. He stormed in. The glass door slammed against the wall, rattling in its frame. But he didn't care. His blood was boiling, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded against his ribs, not just with panic, but with pure, unfiltered rage. His grandfather was missing. And he knew these people had something to do with it. The front desk clerk, a bored-looking woman with a tight ponytail and a name tag that read Mindy, barely glanced up from her computer screen. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" she droned, clicking her mouse with a deliberate slowness that made Jacob's teeth grind. "Where is he?" Jacob's voice was low, barely controlled. Mindy finally looked up, blinking like she had just noticed he was there. "I'm sorry, who?" Jacob leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk. "My grandfather, Walter Carter. Don't play stupid. He's missing, and the only thing left in his house was a letter from you people." He pulled the crumpled notice from his pocket and slapped it onto the desk. "So I'll ask again. Where the hell is he? Mindy's expression didn't change, but there was something, just the faintest flicker of discomfort in her eyes, before she reached for the intercom and pressed the button. Ah, Miss Matthews? You have a visitor. Visitor. Right. Like he was here to discuss landscaping violations. A few agonizing moments later, a sleek wooden door at the end of the hallway opened, and Carol Matthews stepped out. 50-something. Perfectly styled blonde bob. Designer suit. She looked more like a corporate executive than the president of a suburban HOA. But Jacob wasn't fooled. He had dealt with her before. He had heard the stories. She didn't run this HOA. She owned it. Controlled it. Like some miniature dictatorship. Mr. Carter, she greeted smoothly, her voice laced with manufactured politeness. To what do we owe the pleasure? Jacob was across the room before she could blink. Where is my grandfather? The words came out through gritted teeth. Carol tilted her head, the hint of a smirk playing on her lips. Your grandfather? Oh dear, is he missing? She clicked her tongue, feigning concern. Well, that's just awful. Jacob wasn't buying the act. Not for a second. Don't play games with me. I know you've been trying to get him out of that house for years. And now, out of nowhere, he just disappears, and all I find is another one of your goddamn letters. His voice was rising, barely controlled fury laced in every word. Carol let out a small, deliberate sigh, as if he were an unruly child throwing a tantrum. Mr. Carter, I understand you're upset, but perhaps you should take a breath, maybe think about things rationally. People leave all the time. Maybe he decided he didn't want to fight anymore. Maybe he moved to a retirement home. Maybe he... Jacob slammed his fist against her desk so hard that the picture frames rattled. He didn't go anywhere willingly. His voice was a dangerous growl now. He wouldn't leave his cane behind. He wouldn't just disappear without telling me. And he sure as hell wouldn't leave his house with the front door wide open. Carol's smirk faded just a fraction. She glanced toward Mindy, who was suddenly very interested in her keyboard. Jacob took a step closer, locking eyes with her. Tell me where he is. Carol met his gaze without flinching. I'm afraid I can't help you, she said, her tone light, almost bored. Perhaps you should try the police. Jacob let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. The police, right? Because that worked so well last time I called them about you harassing my grandfather. Carol didn't even blink. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. You're damn right it is. She sighed again, dramatically this time, like she was dealing with an exhausting client. Look, if you're that concerned, why don't you check with the retirement homes in town? Maybe he decided to take a little vacation. Jacob's vision flashed white-hot with rage. A vacation? His grandfather. The man who barely left his house unless it was absolutely necessary. The man who hated the idea of nursing homes and would rather drop dead on his porch than let someone else tell him where to live. This wasn't just some bureaucratic nonsense anymore. This was a threat. Jacob stepped back, forcing himself to take a breath before he said something that would land him in jail. I swear to God, if I find out you had anything to do with this. Carol merely smiled, tilting her head ever so slightly. Be careful with your accusations, Mr. Carter. You wouldn't want to say something you might regret. Jacob stared at her, his pulse pounding in his ears. She knew exactly where his grandfather was. She was taunting him. He turned on his heel and stormed out, but not before catching the way Carol exchanged a look with Mindy. It was quick, barely noticeable, but it was there, a flicker of unease. A quiet, wordless confirmation. She was hiding something, and Jacob was going to find out what. Jacob sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His jaw was clenched, his breath coming in sharp, controlled inhales. The HOA was covering something up. Carol's smug little smirk, the way she dodged his questions, the look she shared with her assistant. It all screamed guilty as hell. But what gnawed at him the most was the absolute certainty that they weren't afraid. Not of him. Not of the police. Not of any consequences. They weren't just arrogant. They were protected, which meant his grandfather was in real danger. Jacob slammed his fist against the dashboard, his frustration bubbling over into barely controlled rage. He needed a plan. He needed backup. But who the hell could he call? The police? Useless. They'd probably just shrug and file a missing persons report that would collect dust for weeks. A lawyer? That would take too long. He needed someone who could do more than just ask questions. He needed someone who could act. And then out of nowhere, a memory hit him like a sledgehammer. If anything ever happens to me, don't waste time. Call this number. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head, calm but firm, the way it always was when he was serious. Jacob had laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just old war paranoia. But his grandfather had scribbled a number in the back of his beat-up leather notebook and handed it to him anyway. "I mean it, Jacob. Call them." Jacob had rolled his eyes, muttering something about conspiracy theories, but his grandfather had just looked at him. And that look had been enough to silence any protest. Now, staring at the empty passenger seat where his grandfather should have been, Jacob realized it wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. With shaking fingers, he dug the notebook out of the glove compartment. The number was still there, faded but legible. No name. No details. Just a number. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the dial button. This is insane. It could be nothing. Some outdated contact from his grandfather's military days. Maybe a buddy from his old unit. Maybe a long-disconnected government line that would lead to nothing but an error message. But then he thought about the cane lying in the dirt. The letter on the table. Carol Matthews smirking like she already knew how the story ended. Jacob swallowed hard, exhaled through his nose, and pressed the call button. It rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then the click of a connection. No automated menu. No robotic greeting. Just a deep, steady voice on the other end. "This is Agent Blake." Jacob's throat went dry. He hadn't even spoken yet, but whoever this was, they weren't answering like a regular person. There was no hello or who is this, just straight to business. He forced himself to speak. "I was told to call this number if something happened to Walter Carter." Silence. Not the kind of silence that meant confusion. This was something else. The kind of pause that meant the person on the other end was already putting things together. Then the voice came back, sharper, focused. "What happened to him?" Jacob tightened his grip on the phone. "He's gone." His house was left open. His cane was outside. No sign of a struggle, but the only thing left behind was a letter from the HOA. And they're lying through their teeth about it. Another pause. Then something changed in the agent's tone. "Where are you right now?" Jacob sat up straighter. "In my truck. Just outside their office." "Stay there. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone else. Do you understand me?" A cold shiver ran down Jacob's spine. He had expected skepticism, maybe some half-hearted promise to look into it. He hadn't expected immediate orders. "Who are you?" Jacob asked. 15 minutes. That was all, Agent Blake said before the line went dead. Jacob stared at his phone, his heart hammering. And then, in the distance, he heard them, engines. 3 black SUVs tearing down the suburban streets like they had every right to be there. Jacob barely had time to brace himself before they screeched to a halt in front of the HOA office, doors flying open. Armed men in suits stepped out, and suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare started, Jacob realized he might not have been prepared for what was coming next. Carol Matthews had built her career on control. Every meeting, every interaction, every carefully orchestrated scheme, she dictated the terms. She was the queen of this HOA. Untouchable, feared, and obeyed without question. She had seen homeowners tremble at the sight of her official citations, watched grown men break under the weight of endless fines and legal threats. She had bullied, coerced, and manipulated her way into an empire built on fear. But fear had never felt like this. The moment the glass door to the HOA office swung open, it was like a black hole had entered the room, sucking all the air out. The quiet hum of office chatter died instantly. Phones stopped ringing. The sound of keystrokes from her assistant, Mindy, came to an abrupt halt. Carol turned, expecting some local cop or maybe an angry homeowner foolish enough to challenge her authority. Instead, she came face to face with men in suits. Not the cheap polyester kind worn by HOA lawyers, but government suits, tailored, precise, dark as midnight. There were 4 of them. No name tags, no badges on display. But Carol didn't need a flashing sign to know exactly what they were. Federal. Her stomach plummeted. The man in the lead, a broad-shouldered agent with cold, steel-blue eyes, reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a document. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't ask for permission. He simply held it up, letting the weight of its presence settle over the room. Carol's breath caught in her throat. A federal search warrant. No warning. No prior notice. No opportunity to stall. They knew. They knew. She forced a breath, willing her hands not to tremble as she folded them over her desk. I'm sorry. Who exactly are you? Her voice came out thin. Fragile. The sharpness she was known for, nowhere to be found. The lead agent didn't blink. Where is Walter Carter? The way he said it, cold, direct, surgical, made her spine go rigid. Carol knew how to lie. It was second nature to her, an art perfected through years of evictions and fabricated violations. But something in the way they were looking at her, like she was already classified, already processed, already guilty, sent a raw chill down her spine. She swallowed, forced herself to recover. Mr. Carter? Oh, I'm afraid I don't know where he is. Silence. Not the silence of uncertainty. Not the silence of hesitation. The kind of silence that said, we already know you're lying. The lead agent stepped forward, resting both hands on her desk. His presence suffocating. His voice, when he spoke, was measured. A slow, methodical death sentence. You know, Carol, I don't think you quite understand the gravity of the situation. Her pulse spiked. We don't just know about Walter Carter. His gaze sharpened, slicing into her like a scalpel. We know about the fraudulent citations, the under-the-table deals with developers, the forged votes on HOA amendments, the illegal property seizures. A bead of cold sweat slid down Carol's back. The agent tilted his head, studying her reaction. Shall I go on? Mindy, sitting just a few feet away, visibly shrank in her chair. She was typing again, probably pretending to be busy, but her fingers were shaking against the keyboard. Carol forced a smile, but her jaw felt locked in place. This is ridiculous. These are outrageous claims. I have no idea what you're talking about. A slow blink from the agent. The kind that said, we've dealt with your type before. Carol felt her stomach lurch as he reached into his suit again, this time pulling out a black folder. He let it drop onto her desk with a soft, deadly thud. The folder flipped open. Documents. Photos. Carol's breath hitched. There were drone images of cash transactions between HOA board members and developers. Screenshots of emails discussing how to fabricate violations against homeowners. Signed contracts that directly contradicted public records. And then at the very bottom, an image of Walter Carter. Bound. Eyes fierce but face bruised. Carol's world tilted. The air squeezed out of her lungs. The lead agent tapped the photo with 2 fingers. Where is he? Carol opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She felt exposed. Stripped bare. Her usual defenses useless. The agent's gaze never wavered. And then, as if her silence was answer enough, he turned slightly toward one of the other agents. A silent, wordless command. The second agent nodded and pulled out his phone. Team Bravo, we have confirmation, he said into the receiver. Move on the target location. Carol felt something deep in her stomach drop into a free fall. They weren't asking anymore. They already knew where to go. And they were on their way. The basement smelled of damp concrete and bad decisions. Walter Carter sat bound to a chair, wrists zip-tied, a bruise forming along his cheekbone. But he was grinning. I thought you'd get here faster, he said, eyes sharp as ever. Jacob exhaled, a mix of relief and disbelief. You good? Walter flexed his hands as an agent cut him loose. Oh, I've had worse. These HOA boys. Amateurs. Agent Blake scanned the room. Sir, can you confirm who detained you? Walter rolled his shoulders, standing with a wince. Sure. But first, he reached into his boot, pulling out a USB drive, flipping it toward Blake. That's every illegal land grab, every fraud scheme, every threat the HOA has pulled in the last 15 years. Jacob blinked. What? How? Walter smirked. Because these morons thought I was just some stubborn old vet. They didn't know I spent 20 years in counterintelligence after the war. Didn't know I've been watching them since they started coming after me. Blake studied the drive. So you let them take you? Walter shrugged. Figured they'd lead me straight to the top. Jacob ran a hand through his hair. Grandpa, what the hell? Walter clapped his shoulder. Welcome to the real world, kid. Blake turned to his team. Get this analyzed. We're ending this tonight. Walter grinned. Damn right we are. The crowd closed in, voices sharp with anger. Carol Matthews, usually so composed, looked pale. Her eyes darted as the weight of the situation crashed down on her. This is a mistake, she gasped, hands raised. We were just trying to keep the neighborhood looking respectable. A bitter laugh shot from the crowd. Respectable? Mr. Holloway scoffed. You stole homes. You threatened us, another voice yelled. Carol turned to the agents, desperate. We were enforcing regulations. Blake didn't even blink. Walter smiled. You weren't protecting homes, Walter said, voice steady. You were protecting your power. Blake pulled out the stack of documents, proof of fraud, illegal land grabs, and threats. He held them up, calling them out. Carol stared, silent. The crowd saw the truth. Someone spit near her feet. Lock her up. Lock her up. Lock her up. Carol flinched. Blake gave the nod. Handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Walter exhaled, satisfied. The HOA's reign was over. The fall of the HOA wasn't just a takedown. It was a reckoning. The arrests started early in the morning, just as the suburban streets were waking up. Black SUVs and unmarked government cars rolled into the neighborhood like a silent invasion, stopping outside pristine, meticulously maintained homes. Federal agents moved fast. They didn't just go after Carol Matthews, they went after all of them. Every board member who had signed off on fraudulent citations. Every corrupt official who had looked the other way. Every developer who had paid bribes to seize land. No one was safe. Some were pulled from their beds, barely awake when their doors were kicked in. Others were yanked from their offices, surrounded by agents in suits while their stunned employees watched in horror. One board member was caught mid-golf swing at an exclusive country club, a perfectly aimed shot interrupted by the cold click of handcuffs. The FBI froze their assets on the spot, bank accounts locked, property deals canceled. Every dirty transaction, every under-the-table deal, every stolen home, all of it was laid bare for the world to see. By mid-afternoon, the story had exploded across national news. FBI raids HOA board members in unprecedented corruption case. Suburban extortion ring exposed. Millions in fraudulent violations uncovered. Homeowners rejoice as HOA leaders face federal charges. Jacob scrolled through his phone, reading article after article, watching video clips of stunned newscasters reporting on one of the biggest suburban corruption scandals in history. And the best part, there was no way out for them. They couldn't pay their way out of this. They couldn't intimidate their way out of this. They had spent years playing judge, jury, and executioner, but now they were the ones being judged. And Carol Matthews? She was done. The once untouchable queen of the HOA was reduced to a trembling mess, standing on the front steps of the board office as agents placed her in handcuffs. Cameras flashed in her face. Reporters shouted over each other. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Ms. Matthews, do you deny the allegations? Ms. Matthews, were you aware of the fraud? What do you have to say to the homeowners who lost their property because of you? Carol's mouth opened, but no words came out. The same woman who had spent years running this place with an iron fist suddenly had nothing to say. She had controlled everything, until now. And Walter Carter? Walter Carter was watching from his porch, looking as relaxed as ever. The same house they had spent years trying to erase, the same home they had called an eyesore, was now officially off limits to the HOA forever. With the evidence from Walter's USB drive, the government had classified the Carter house as a historic landmark. No HOA. No developers. No legal loopholes. They couldn't touch it. The house they tried to destroy was now untouchable. It was poetic. It was perfect. Walter leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as the last of the federal vehicles pulled out of the neighborhood. Jacob sat down next to him, still trying to wrap his head around everything. You know, Walter said, stretching his legs out, I fought a lot of battles in my life. Been in war zones, seen some real nasty fights. He took a slow sip of his coffee, shaking his head with amusement. But I got to tell you, kid. Walter smirked. Taking down an HOA might have been the easiest war I've ever won. The moment Walter Carter stepped out of the black SUV, it was as if the entire world had been waiting for him. The street outside his house, the same street where the HOA had ruled like kings for years, was now filled with something entirely different. People, neighbors, families, reporters. And they weren't afraid anymore. They were cheering. A sea of faces lined the sidewalks, standing on porches, leaning out of windows. Some held their phones up, recording the moment. Others just stood there, watching with a mixture of relief, admiration, and something else. Something like awe. Because Walter Carter wasn't just coming home. He was returning as the man who had done the impossible. And the press? They were everywhere. Microphones were thrust forward. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts. Voices overlapped in an eager frenzy. Mr. Carter, how does it feel to be back? Mr. Carter, did you ever think this day would come? Mr. Carter, what do you have to say to the people who tried to take your home? Walter didn't rush to answer. He just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The sight of his house. The porch swing that had been there for decades. The familiar creak of the wooden steps beneath his boots. The place they had tried to erase from existence. But it was still here. And so was he. Jacob stood beside him, watching as people clapped, called his grandfather a hero, shook his hand, patted him on the back, thanked him, not just for what he had done now, but for what he had done long before any of this ever started. Because Walter Carter wasn't just a stubborn old man who refused to sell his house. He was a soldier, a veteran, a survivor, a fighter. He had fought for his country in a war most people barely remembered. Anymore, he had survived battles that would have broken lesser men. And then, when he came home, he had fought again. Not on some distant battlefield, not against an enemy overseas, but right here, in the very place he had called home for decades. Because power-hungry bureaucrats in an HOA boardroom thought they could break him. They thought they could erase him the same way they had erased so many others. They thought they could bully him into silence. They had no idea who they were up against. And now they were gone. Their bank accounts were frozen, their houses seized, their power wiped out in a matter of hours. And Walter? Walter was still standing. Jacob let out a slow breath, shaking his head as the realization hit him. His grandfather wasn't just some guy who refused to move. Walter Carter was history. The kind of man people would tell stories about. The kind of man they would write books about. The kind of man who couldn't be erased, no matter how hard someone tried. The HOA had thrown everything at him. They had tried to break him, to beat him, to strip him of everything he had built. And yet, here he was, standing taller than ever as the world watched and applauded his victory. Jacob looked at his grandfather, the bruises on his face already fading, the same steady fire still burning in his eyes. Walter glanced at him, smirked just a little, and clapped a firm hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You know what the funny thing is, kid?" Walter said, voice low and amused. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "What?" Walter let out a slow exhale, scanning the crowd, the cameras, the people who once feared the HOA but were now free because of him. "They thought they could take me down." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Turns out, I was the one taking them down all along."